The shelves were empty before most people even realized the storm had started. It happened in March of 2020, and it happened again during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and it will happen again the next time uncertainty grips the American consciousness with sufficient force. What you need to understand is not simply that stores run out of supplies during crises, but rather that they run out following such predictable patterns that we can map the psychology of collapse with the precision of actuarial science. The first items to vanish from retail shelves tell us more about human nature and systemic vulnerability than any government report or academic study ever could, because they reveal the exact sequence in which modern society begins to fracture when pressures exceed its design tolerances. I have spent 3 decades studying the patterns of societal stress, from the bread riots of revolutionary France to the bank runs of 1929 to the supply disruptions we witnessed during the pandemic. And what becomes clear is that Americans live atop a logistical infrastructure so finely tuned that it operates with almost no margin for error whatsoever. The grocery store nearest your home right now contains approximately 3 to 7 days' worth of inventory for its customer base, assuming normal purchasing patterns. And the warehouse supplying that store operates on similar assumptions of predictable consumer behavior and uninterrupted transportation networks. This arrangement, known throughout the business world as just-in-time inventory management, transformed American retail over the past 40 years by dramatically reducing the costs associated with storing excess products. But it also created a vulnerability so profound that even minor disruptions can cascade into genuine shortages within a time frame measured in hours rather than days or weeks. When Hurricane Katrina made landfall on August 29th in 2005, residents of the Gulf Coast discovered that bottled water had disappeared from stores within 6 hours of the evacuation orders. And by the following morning, bread, canned goods, batteries, and gasoline had joined the list of unavailable essentials. The Biden administration's investigation into pandemic-era supply chain failures concluded that just-in-time practices had increased risk across industries, from automotive manufacturing to pharmaceutical production, by eliminating safety stock and reducing the ability of companies to adapt quickly to demand fluctuations. This is the world we have built, and it functions beautifully until the moment it does not. I want you to continue watching until the end of this documentary, because understanding these patterns completely could mean the difference between preparedness and panic for your family. And I would like to know where you are watching from. So please leave a comment with your city and country. The psychological mechanics of panic buying have been studied extensively by behavioral economists and consumer researchers, particularly following the extraordinary scenes we witnessed during the initial months of the COVID-19 pandemic, when American shoppers stripped stores of toilet paper, hand sanitizer, cleaning supplies, and shelf-stable foods with a speed and thoroughness that shocked retail executives who thought they had seen everything. A comprehensive study published in the Journal of Retailing and Consumer Services examined how psychological factors, including uncertainty, perceptions of severity, perceptions of scarcity, and anxiety influenced panic purchasing behavior during the pandemic. And the researchers found that these elements combined to create a self-reinforcing cycle, wherein initial shortages triggered anxiety, which motivated additional panic buying, which created further shortages, which intensified anxiety throughout the consumer population. What makes this particularly relevant to understanding modern vulnerability is that the trigger for this cascade does not require an actual shortage of goods at the wholesale or manufacturing level, but merely the perception among consumers that shortages might develop in the future, which transforms prudent preparation into irrational hoarding within a remarkably compressed time frame. The study found that perceived scarcity had a positive relationship with consumer anxiety, and anxiety in turn had a positive relationship with panic purchasing behavior, meaning that once the cycle begins, it develops its own momentum independent of actual supply conditions. During Hurricane Katrina, gasoline prices surged 30% within a single week, reaching constant dollar levels not experienced since 1981. And federal officials found themselves issuing public statements urging Americans not to engage in panic buying, even as motorists in several parts of the country literally came to blows at gas stations, where tensions from localized shortages and long lines boiled over into physical confrontations. The hurricane had damaged refinery infrastructure along the Gulf Coast, certainly, but the severity of the shortages owed as much to consumer behavior as to actual production disruptions, because the fear of not having gasoline tomorrow motivated people to fill their tanks and their spare containers today, which drain stations faster than supply lines could replenish them even in areas geographically distant from the hurricane's path. This pattern repeats with such regularity throughout American history that we can identify the precise categories of goods that disappear first whenever the social fabric experiences significant stress. And these 7 categories tell us something profound about both human psychology and infrastructure fragility. The first item to vanish is always water. And this makes perfect biological sense, given that the human body can survive perhaps 3 days without hydration, whereas it might last 3 weeks without food. So when uncertainty strikes, our deepest survival instincts direct us towards securing the most time-critical resource first. During Hurricane Katrina, the storm surge and flooding contaminated municipal water systems throughout New Orleans and surrounding parishes, which meant that tap water became unsafe to drink precisely when people needed hydration most in the late summer heat, without electricity for air conditioning. And the demand for bottled water increased so dramatically that supply chains simply could not respond quickly enough. The problem was compounded by transportation difficulties because many roads used to deliver water were underwater or unsafe to drive on, thereby decreasing the supply of bottled water at exactly the moment when demand had surged to unprecedented levels. And the combined effect was that water became nearly impossible to obtain through normal retail channels within the first day following the hurricane's landfall. The same pattern emerged during the pandemic when consumers, uncertain about the duration of lockdowns or the possibility of supply interruptions, purchased water in quantities far exceeding their actual needs, motivated not by present thirst, but by future anxiety. Water filtration systems, purification tablets, and storage containers disappeared from retail inventory almost as quickly as bottled water itself, because consumers who understood the underlying dynamics recognized that the ability to purify water from alternative sources provided insurance against supply disruptions that might last weeks or months rather than days. The vulnerability here extends beyond consumer psychology to infrastructure reality, because American municipal water systems depend on electrical power for pumping and treatment, which means that any disruption to the electrical grid potentially compromises water supply even in areas where the water source itself remains uncontaminated. And this creates cascading dependencies, wherein one infrastructure failure triggers secondary and tertiary failures throughout the systems that modern urban life requires. The recognition of these dependencies explains why people who have studied crisis preparedness consistently identify water security as the paramount concern, because everything else you might need to survive assumes that you have already solved the hydration problem. And if you have not, the timeline becomes very short very quickly. Non-perishable food items constitute the second category to disappear, following water by perhaps 6 to 12 hours depending on the nature and severity of the crisis. And here again we see rational survival calculation intersecting with supply chain vulnerability. Canned goods vanish first, particularly beans, vegetables, and proteins like tuna and chicken, because they combine long shelf life with nutritional value and the certainty of edibility without requiring cooking, which matters enormously when electrical power or natural gas might be unavailable. Rice, pasta, flour, and dried beans follow closely behind, representing the staples that have sustained human populations for centuries, and that American consumers instinctively recognize as reliable calories that can be stretched across many meals. The pandemic revealed something fascinating about the hierarchy of food hoarding, because consumers did not simply clear shelves randomly, but rather made surprisingly consistent choices that reflected both nutritional awareness and storage practicality, prioritizing items with the optimal combination of caloric density, shelf stability, preparation simplicity, and versatility across different meals. What makes this vulnerability particularly acute in the American context is that our food supply system, like our inventory management generally, operates on assumptions of steady demand and uninterrupted logistics, with grocery stores receiving multiple deliveries per week rather than maintaining substantial on-site storage. The just-in-time system that revolutionized retail efficiency over the past generation has created a situation where the food supply for any given American community exists not in warehouses or storerooms, but rather in transit aboard trucks moving along highways. And any significant disruption to transportation networks therefore translates almost immediately into empty shelves regardless of whether farms are still producing or food processing facilities are still operating. The 2020 pandemic demonstrated this with particular clarity when meat processing plants experienced COVID outbreaks among workers. Because even though cattle and pigs continued to exist in normal numbers and consumer demand remained relatively stable, the bottleneck at the processing stage created shortages that rippled through the entire supply network within days. And grocery stores found themselves rationing meat purchases per customer, while ranchers faced the economically devastating prospect of having to euthanize animals they could not process. These systemic vulnerabilities mean that the American food supply, despite the incredible agricultural productivity of our farmland and the sophisticated distribution networks we have constructed, remains fragile in ways that most citizens never considered during ordinary times. And this fragility becomes immediately apparent the moment extraordinary circumstances arise. Medical supplies and pharmaceuticals represent the third category to experience rapid depletion. And this category carries particular urgency because, unlike food or water, where substitutions or alternatives might be improvised, many medications have no equivalence, and their absence creates genuine medical emergencies for the millions of Americans who depend on prescription drugs to manage chronic conditions. The pandemic created unprecedented demand for basic first aid supplies, over-the-counter fever reducers, and protective equipment like masks and gloves. But it also exposed something more troubling about pharmaceutical supply chains, which is that a substantial percentage of both active pharmaceutical ingredients and finished medications consumed in the United States are manufactured overseas, primarily in China and India, which means that international disruptions can rapidly translate into domestic shortages. The Biden administration's supply chain review identified pharmaceuticals as one of the sectors where just-in-time practices and offshoring had created the most significant vulnerabilities, because the combination of minimal domestic inventory and distant manufacturing meant that any interruption to international shipping or foreign production could leave American patients without access to essential medications. For individuals managing diabetes, heart conditions, thyroid disorders, or any of the dozens of other chronic illnesses that require daily medication, the prospect of even a brief supply interruption represents not mere inconvenience, but genuine life threat. And this explains why pharmacies experience surges in prescription refill requests at the slightest hint of potential disruptions, as patients attempt to build personal reserves against the possibility of future scarcity. The insulin crisis that periodically flares in American healthcare provides a sobering preview of what happens when critical medications become scarce, as patients ration life-sustaining drugs or resort to dangerous alternatives because they cannot afford or obtain the medications their conditions require. Beyond prescription drugs, items like bandages, antiseptics, pain relievers, thermometers, and basic diagnostic supplies disappear rapidly during crises because households recognize that access to professional medical care may become difficult or impossible if hospitals are overwhelmed or transportation is disrupted. And having the capability to manage minor injuries and illnesses at home transforms from convenience into necessity. Under those circumstances, fuel and energy sources comprise the fourth category to vanish. And this disappearance often happens with striking speed because transportation fuel represents immediate mobility, while portable power sources represent continued function of critical devices even if grid electricity fails. The gasoline shortages during Hurricane Katrina demonstrated how quickly fuel supplies can be exhausted when panic intersects with actual supply disruption, as the hurricane damaged refinery infrastructure that supplied much of the Gulf Coast region, while simultaneously triggering massive evacuation and preparation efforts that drastically increased fuel demand. Benchmark crude oil prices surged to $70 per barrel, and average pump prices for gasoline rose to an all-time high above $3 per gallon, representing levels not seen since the early 1980s, and motorists in multiple states engaged in physical altercations at gas stations as tensions from localized shortages and extended wait times boiled over into violence. The 2021 ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline, which temporarily shut down the pipeline supplying nearly half of the East Coast gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, provided another stark demonstration of fuel system vulnerability, as gas stations from Georgia to Virginia experienced shortages within days despite the pipeline operator paying the ransom and restoring operations relatively quickly. Propane for heating and cooking, batteries of all sizes for flashlights and essential devices, and portable generators for backup electricity all disappear from retail availability within the first 24 to 48 hours of any crisis that threatens power grid stability, because households recognize that modern life depends absolutely on reliable energy, and that even brief interruptions create cascading difficulties affecting everything from food preservation to medical device operation to basic climate control. The dependency is so complete that most Americans struggle to imagine functioning without it. And this psychological reality drives the panic that empties stores of energy-related products faster than almost anything except water. Human dignity and daily comfort explain why hygiene and sanitation products constitute the fifth category to experience panic buying. As the COVID-19 toilet paper phenomenon demonstrated with almost absurd clarity, when American consumers stripped stores of bathroom tissue with such thoroughness that the images of empty shelves became iconic symbols of the pandemic's early days. The behavior puzzled many observers who could not understand why toilet paper specifically became the focus of such intense hoarding. But consumer psychologists recognized that the panic reflected a deep need for control and normalcy in circumstances where larger systems felt uncontrollable and abnormal. So people fixated on securing the basic elements of daily routine as a psychological defense against the uncertainty surrounding them. Cleaning supplies, including bleach, disinfectants, and hand sanitizer, disappeared almost as quickly, driven by public health guidance about surface transmission and the need for constant sanitation, while soap, shampoo, toothpaste, feminine hygiene products, and other personal care items experienced similar depletion, as consumers attempted to ensure they could maintain basic hygiene standards regardless of how long disruptions might last. The pandemic revealed that these items carry psychological weight far beyond their practical function, representing the maintenance of civilization and human dignity even in circumstances that threaten both, and their absence from stores therefore triggers anxiety disproportionate to the actual survival necessity of having precisely the preferred brand of shampoo or toilet paper. Substitutions and alternatives exist for virtually all of these products, and previous generations managed daily hygiene with far simpler and more improvised solutions than modern consumers consider acceptable. But the emotional importance of maintaining normal routines explains why these items disappear from shelves with remarkable speed whenever uncertainty makes people question whether such normalcy will continue. Baby formula and infant supplies merit particular mention within this category because parents with young children face genuinely zero substitution scenarios. As the 2022 baby formula shortage demonstrated, when a combination of manufacturing shutdowns and supply chain disruptions created a genuine crisis for families whose infants depended on specific formula types that suddenly became unavailable through normal retail channels. The desperation of parents unable to feed their babies revealed a vulnerability that goes beyond mere inconvenience into actual harm. And this explains why infant supplies consistently rank among the first items to vanish whenever supply disruptions threaten, as parents recognize that they bear absolute responsibility for securing what their children need to survive and will take extraordinary measures to fulfill that responsibility. The seventh and final category consists of security-related items, including firearms, ammunition, and home defense equipment, and the demand surges in this category during periods of civil unrest or perceived societal breakdown reveal deep currents in American culture regarding self-reliance and the protection of home and family. Background check requests for firearm purchases spiked dramatically during election years, following high-profile incidents of civil disorder, or when public statements by political figures suggest potential restrictions on gun ownership. because Americans who value Second Amendment rights recognize that the window for legal purchase may be time-limited and the need for self-defense capability may increase during periods of heightened social tension. Ammunition shortages have become increasingly common over the past 15 years, driven by a combination of increased demand, manufacturing constraints, and hoarding behavior among consumers who remember previous shortages and attempt to build reserves while supplies remain available. The pattern reflects a fundamental question about social contract and government capacity, which is whether citizens can rely on public law enforcement to maintain order and protect persons and property during extraordinary circumstances, or whether households must take responsibility for their own security when systems break down. Hurricane Katrina provided a sobering case study in this question, as the flooding and chaos that engulfed New Orleans created conditions where law enforcement capability was severely degraded for days or weeks in some neighborhoods, and residents found themselves navigating genuine lawlessness without the protection of functional civil authority. The experience reinforced beliefs among many Americans that self-reliance and preparation for self-defense represent not paranoia, but rather prudent recognition of the limits of government protection during genuine emergencies. Security hardware, including reinforced doors, window locks, alarm systems, and surveillance equipment, similarly experiences increased demand during periods of elevated concern about civil order, as households attempt to harden their homes against potential threats. The rapidity with which these items disappear from retail availability during crisis periods reveals both the scale of demand and the relatively limited supply that exists under normal circumstances, because manufacturers and retailers do not maintain inventory sufficient to meet panic-driven demand spikes, which means that once buying begins, scarcity develops quickly and further accelerates the panic that drives additional purchases. These 7 categories of rapidly disappearing goods tell us something crucial about the intersection of human psychology, infrastructure design, and societal resilience in contemporary America, which is that the systems providing for our daily needs operate with extraordinary efficiency during normal times, but possess almost no capacity to absorb disruption during abnormal times, and the transition between these states can occur with stunning speed. The just-in-time inventory practices that enable competitive pricing and efficient capital deployment have simultaneously created vulnerabilities that become apparent only during the stress events when we most need supply system resilience. Consumer behavior during these events follows predictable patterns rooted in survival instinct and scarcity psychology, which means that even people who intellectually understand that panic buying creates artificial scarcity find themselves participating in the panic anyway, because the alternative is risking that their household will be among those caught without essential supplies when stores actually run out. The result is a self-fulfilling prophecy wherein the fear of shortage creates the shortage, and the shortage validates the fear that motivated the panic buying in the first place. The 7 categories of goods that disappear first during crises represent symptoms rather than causes, which is the crucial distinction that separates superficial understanding from genuine comprehension of how modern American society functions under stress and what happens when the mechanisms of normalcy begin to fail. What we witness when store shelves empty within hours is not simply a logistics problem or a consumer behavior anomaly, but rather the visible manifestation of deeper systemic vulnerabilities that exist throughout the infrastructure sustaining contemporary life. And these vulnerabilities create cascading failures, wherein initial disruptions trigger secondary problems, which generate tertiary complications, which eventually threaten the social fabric itself if conditions deteriorate sufficiently or persist long enough. The economic literature on supply chain disruptions during the pandemic period reveals that these cascades follow predictable patterns rooted in the interconnected nature of modern commerce, where disruptions in one sector rapidly propagate throughout the entire economic system because businesses operate with minimal inventory buffers and depend on reliable logistics networks that have little capacity to absorb shock. Research published by the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland examined how supply chain disruptions contributed to the inflation surge that began in late 2020 and accelerated through 2021 and 2022, finding that supply shocks had larger impacts on price levels than demand shocks, with the point estimates indicating that supply disruptions boosted prices by approximately 0.25% over a 3-year period, which might sound modest until you recognize that this effect compounds across thousands of products throughout the consumer economy. The researchers distinguished between aggregate supply shocks and supply chain disruptions specifically, demonstrating that disruptions lengthen supplier delivery times while simultaneously depressing employment and raising prices, which created the unusual economic circumstance of simultaneous inflation and reduced economic activity that contradicts the typical patterns described in classical economics. The pandemic revealed something that many Americans had forgotten or never knew, which is that prosperity and abundance depend not on the existence of productive capacity somewhere in the world, but rather on the continuous functioning of the logistics systems that move goods from production sites to consumption locations. And when those logistics systems experience disruption, scarcity develops regardless of whether factories are producing or warehouses contain inventory. The inflationary consequences of supply chain disruptions operate through multiple channels that reinforce each other in ways that make price increases both more severe and more persistent than simple supply and demand models would predict. Because the shortage of specific components or materials forces manufacturers to compete for limited supplies, which drives up input costs, which must be passed along to consumers in the form of higher prices, while simultaneously the delays and uncertainties in supply chains force businesses to order earlier and in larger quantities, which increases working capital requirements and inventory carrying costs, which also contribute to price increases. Academic research into the relationship between supply chain shortages and inflation during 2021 found that market concentration played a significant role in amplifying price increases, as industries dominated by a few large firms experienced more pronounced price spikes than competitive industries with many similarly sized companies. And this concentration effect could account for up to 23% of United States inflation during that year. The mechanism works because large firms with substantial market power can exploit supply shortages to raise prices beyond what would be necessary merely to cover increased costs, effectively using the crisis as an opportunity to expand profit margins while blaming inflation on external factors beyond their control. And consumers have little recourse because the absence of competitive alternatives means they must either pay the elevated prices or do without the goods entirely. The research found that industries with higher pre-existing concentration levels experienced larger output drops during supply shortages, indicating that market power actually amplifies supply shocks rather than cushioning against them, as economic theory sometimes suggests. Because dominant firms have less incentive to maintain resilient supply chains or excess capacity when they can simply raise prices to ration limited supplies among consumers desperate to obtain their products. This dynamic transforms temporary supply disruptions into sustained inflation that persists even after the initial disruption resolves, because firms that successfully raise prices during the shortage period have little motivation to reduce them afterward, especially when they can attribute the elevated prices to ongoing cost pressures that may or may not actually exist at levels sufficient to justify the pricing. The social consequences of this economic cascade extend far beyond the inconvenience of higher prices at the grocery store or gas station, because inflation erodes purchasing power, which means that working families find their wages buying less each month even if nominal income remains stable. And this erosion creates financial stress that manifests in delayed bill payments, increased credit card debt, reduced savings, and ultimately threats to housing security for households operating without substantial financial cushion. The labor market dynamics during 2021 illustrated how supply chain disruptions, inflation, and social tension interact to create conditions that threaten economic stability, as workers who saw their real wages declining due to inflation began demanding higher nominal wages to compensate, while simultaneously many workers chose to exit the labor force entirely rather than continuing in positions where compensation no longer seemed adequate relative to working conditions and cost of living. Increases The wave of strikes and labor actions during that period reflected not merely union organizing, but rather genuine frustration among workers who found themselves working harder for wages that purchased less, while employers facing their own cost pressures from supply disruptions struggled to offer the compensation increases that would retain staff without pricing their products out of the market entirely. The result was a vicious cycle wherein supply shortages drove inflation, which reduced real wages, which triggered labor shortages, which exacerbated supply problems, which intensified inflation. And escaping this cycle required either substantial intervention to break the pattern or enough time passing that various factors adjusted naturally back toward equilibrium. Assuming equilibrium could be reached before social frustration boiled over into something more destructive. The White House economic analysis confirmed that supply chain impacts during the pandemic drove up consumer prices, while simultaneously inflation reduced disposable income and increased costs for materials and transportation, creating feedback loops where each problem worsened the others. These dynamics matter because they reveal how quickly economic disruptions translate into social stress that affects daily life for ordinary Americans trying to pay bills and feed families. And history demonstrates repeatedly that when sufficient numbers of people feel economically squeezed beyond tolerance, social stability begins to fray in ways that create secondary crises independent of whatever triggered the initial economic disruption. The Great Depression provides the most comprehensive American example of how economic collapse generates social consequences that extend far beyond financial metrics into the fundamental character of daily life and community relations. Because the unemployment and poverty that peaked in the early 1930s created conditions where millions of Americans faced genuine destitution without the social safety net programs that later generations would take for granted. Crime rates rose rapidly as unemployed workers resorted to petty theft to feed their families, while suicide rates increased among those who saw no path forward from their circumstances, and malnutrition became common enough to constitute a public health crisis in a nation that had recently been among the world's most prosperous. Prostitution increased as desperate women sought any means to pay rent and buy food, while healthcare became something accessed only in the direst emergencies because visiting doctors represented an unaffordable luxury for families struggling with basic subsistence. And alcoholism rose as Americans sought psychological escape from circumstances they felt powerless to change, particularly after Prohibition's repeal in 1933 made alcohol legally available again. The visible manifestations of this social breakdown included Hoovervilles springing up on vacant lots throughout urban areas, where homeless families constructed makeshift shelters from cardboard boxes, scrap wood, and canvas, living in conditions that would have been unthinkable just years earlier during the prosperity of the 1920s. Homelessness reached levels unprecedented in American history as men left families behind to ride freight trains across the country, searching for any work that might allow them to send money home, becoming known as transients who flooded major cities and overwhelmed train stations with desperate job seekers who found that opportunities simply did not exist regardless of their willingness to work. The social fabric frayed as traditional assumptions about individual effort leading to economic security proved hollow, and communities that had functioned through mutual trust and informal cooperation found those bonds strained when scarcity made people competitors for insufficient resources rather than neighbors supporting each other through temporary hardship. Black communities faced particularly severe impacts as racial discrimination ensured they received last consideration for available jobs and government assistance, leading to grassroots organizing around Don't Buy Where You Can't Work boycotts and community-based healthcare initiatives that addressed needs ignored by mainstream institutions. The Depression demonstrated that economic collapse does not merely make people poorer, but rather transforms society itself by breaking the assumptions and relationships that enable communities to function cooperatively rather than dissolving into competition for survival. If you are finding value in this analysis, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you can stay informed about the vulnerabilities facing modern society and how to prepare intelligently for disruptions that history suggests will recur. Make sure to activate the notification bell so you do not miss future content, and leave a comment telling me what city and country you are watching from so I can understand where this information is reaching and what specific regional concerns might be relevant to explore in future episodes. The Texas power grid failure in February of 2021 provides a more recent illustration of how infrastructure breakdown creates cascading crises that threaten lives within time frames measured in hours and days rather than weeks or months. Because when Winter Storm Uri brought unusual cold temperatures to the state, the electrical grid proved unable to handle demand, while simultaneously many power generation facilities experienced failures due to frozen equipment, and the combination resulted in more than 4.5 million homes and businesses losing power for periods ranging from hours to days. At least 246 people died directly or indirectly from crisis, with some estimates suggesting the actual toll may have reached 702 deaths, and the victims ranged from infants less than 1 year old to elderly individuals over 100 years of age, with almost 2/3 of confirmed deaths resulting from hypothermia as people tried to survive in unheated homes during sub-freezing temperatures. The deaths resulted not only from cold exposure, but also from carbon monoxide poisoning, as desperate residents used unsafe heating methods, from house fires started by candles or improper heating equipment, from car crashes on icy roads as people tried to reach warming centers, and from other secondary effects of the infrastructure failure. The crisis revealed how completely modern life depends on reliable electricity, because the power failure didn't simply leave people in cold darkness, but rather triggered failures throughout other infrastructure systems. As water treatment facilities lost power, which meant pumps stopped working, which meant pressure dropped in water mains, which meant boil water notices had to be issued, except many residents lacked the electricity or gas needed to boil water, while simultaneously the cold temperatures caused pipes to freeze and burst in thousands of homes, creating flooding that destroyed property and further reduced habitable shelter. Grocery stores could not maintain refrigeration, which meant food supplies spoiled, while gas stations could not pump fuel, which meant residents could not evacuate even if they recognized a danger, and hospitals struggled to maintain operations while dealing with surges in emergency patients suffering hypothermia and carbon monoxide poisoning at the same time their own utilities were failing. The compounding nature of these failures illustrated the domino effect that characterizes infrastructure breakdown, where losing one critical system triggers failures throughout other systems that depend on it, and the speed of the cascade can quickly overwhelm both government response capacity and individual household resilience, especially when the affected population numbers in the millions across a geographic area spanning hundreds of miles. The Texas crisis also demonstrated how economic impacts from infrastructure failures extend far beyond the immediate emergency period, because the property damage from frozen pipes, roof collapses from ice accumulation, and other storm-related destruction required months to repair, while insurance companies disputed coverage and contractors faced overwhelming demand that drove prices upward. And many families found themselves displaced from damaged homes while simultaneously dealing with lost wages from businesses that closed during the crisis and facing increased utility bills from providers seeking to recover costs incurred during the emergency. The estimated economic cost exceeded $100 billion when accounting for property damage, lost economic activity, emergency response expenses, and long-term impacts on business confidence and investment, making it one of the costliest natural disasters in United States history despite lasting less than a week in its acute phase. The political recriminations following the crisis revealed deep disagreements about responsibility and appropriate responses, with debates about whether the failures resulted from deregulation, inadequate winterization requirements, over-reliance on specific energy sources, or inevitable consequences of extreme weather that exceeded reasonable planning assumptions. And these debates remained unresolved years later, leaving uncertainty about whether similar failures might recur in future extreme weather events. For individual Texans who endured days without power, heat, or water during sub-freezing temperatures, the experience provided visceral education about infrastructure fragility and government response limitations that no amount of abstract discussion could replicate. Because living through genuine deprivation even briefly creates understanding that comfortable theorizing never achieves. The families who lost members to hypothermia, carbon monoxide poisoning, or other crisis-related causes paid the ultimate price for systemic vulnerabilities that officials had long known existed, but failed to address with sufficient urgency or resources. The pattern repeating through Hurricane Katrina, the Great Depression, the pandemic supply shocks, and the Texas grid failure reveals fundamental truths about how modern American society operates under stress, and what happens when the mechanisms ensuring normalcy break down temporarily or threaten to fail permanently. The initial disappearance of water, food, medicine, fuel, hygiene products, infant supplies, and security items represents rational individual response to perceived threats. But the aggregate effect of millions of households acting on similar threat perceptions creates the scarcity that validates the fear and intensifies the panic, generating feedback loops that exhaust supplies far faster than logistics systems designed for normal demand patterns can possibly replenish. The economic consequences then cascade through inflation, unemployment, business failures, and government fiscal stress as tax revenues decline while emergency expenditure needs increase, creating conditions where the capacity to respond effectively diminishes precisely when response capability matters most. The social fabric phrase as trust erodes. Cooperation gives way to competition for scarce resources, crime increases, vulnerable populations suffer disproportionately, and the basic assumptions enabling civil society to function cooperatively begin to fail under pressure from legitimate fear and material deprivation. The infrastructure interdependencies mean that failure in one system rapidly propagates to others, as loss of electrical power compromises water treatment, as transportation disruptions prevent fuel delivery, as communication network failures prevent coordination of emergency response. And the compounding effects create situations far more severe than the sum of individual system failures would suggest. What becomes clear from examining these historical cases is that the window between apparent normalcy and genuine crisis can be extraordinarily brief, measured sometimes in hours rather than days, and that the speed of deterioration can overwhelm both government response capacity and individual household preparedness unless preparation happened proactively during calm periods rather than reactively once problems became obvious to everyone simultaneously.